Now, the Russians are mixed up in this crisis, not just as Assad's allies, but also because they have troops on the ground, including in the base where that overnight airstrike took place. But what can Moscow actually do beyond these thinly veiled threats, as we heard there from Thomas Lowe, our correspondent in Moscow, of a possible collision between Russian and US jets?
I don't think you cut off your nose to spite yourself if you're Vladimir Putin. It doesn't really make sense, I don't think, for the Russians to introduce a measure like that at the moment. Their pilots will be put at just as much risk as US pilots. And possible consequences of a collision or an exchange of fire in the air between US and Russian aircraft don't really bear thinking about. I don't think Moscow is going to act irrationally and go down that road. If anything, one would expect from Vladimir Putin on past performance entirely rational, predictable behavior. That's maybe not the case with Donald Trump, much more mercurial and some would say irrational, but I don't think that Russia is going to take measures like that. We've heard the Russians raising the possibility of strengthening Syrian air defenses. That's a risky move as well, particularly if it involves Russians or Russian installations shooting down perhaps US cruise missiles, but also because of the risk that would bring Russia into conflict with Israel, who would be loath to see Syrian air defences strengthened and would be tempted to attack any installations put in to achieve that goal. So, you know, the options really are not that great at the moment for Russia. It would be very interesting, I think, to see what comes out of the meeting between Rex Tillerson and Sergei Lavrov when they meet in Moscow on Tuesday. One has to assume, given the speed with which the Americans decided to take this action, that they have evidence which we don't yet know. Perhaps that is satellite imagery of the airbase and what that led them to believe about the weapons being used by the Syrian Air Force. But I would imagine that if they do have that evidence, Rex Tillerson will be presenting it to the Russians during that meeting. That, consequently, subsequently, further down the road, may have an impact on the way the Russians respond. The problem, of course, though, as Rex Tillerson has already pointed out, is that there were Russians on that airbase. So if the Syrians were loading chemical weapons onto their aircraft for that attack, either, as Tillerson put it, they were complicit or incompetent. Now, if that's the message she's taking to Moscow, it's going to be a very tough meeting.
And the US says it warned Russia before the strike, which pretty much amounts to warning Syria, because, as you said, both are on the ground in the same base, and therefore giving it time to prepare for this type of assault. Was this perhaps a political rather than a military message that was being sent?
Well, the warning, as I understand it, was not delivered to Moscow. It was a local warning to Russian forces on the ground, giving them sufficient time to clear their men off that base. In other words, it was a military message. We're about to attack. We advise you to get out. It wasn't a message that was sent to the Kremlin. It wasn't a message that was shared with the Chinese either, unless Donald Trump passed it over to Xi Jinping during their dinner on Thursday. But no, I think this was primarily military.
Because the Russians are attacking this and saying that it's had little military effect. They're talking about its effectiveness, but is that really where this was? No,
I don't think. Not in that sense. I think this is simply a warning from the United States to the Syrian government and, to a degree, to the Russians as well. This cannot go on any further. This is my red line. And it's an indication, too, that under this administration, there isn't going to be the sort of slow, steady consensus building that we saw under Barack Obama's administration. Donald Trump is a much more impulsive political leader. He's going to act on his gut feelings. And if he says, this has got to stop, otherwise I'm going to do something, you better believe him that he's going to do something.
And you were just rapidly, if you would, talking about Trump as the mercurial character in this situation and Putin hopefully as the rational character who will have a rational response. But this is kind of, from the diplomatic point of view, it feels like the tables are turned. It's a mirror image of what we saw before with Putin acting unilaterally on Crimea, for instance, and Obama running to the UN. This time we're seeing Vladimir Putin turn towards the UN Security Council for a meeting. How significant is that switch?
Well, I don't think it's enormously significant. I think it's the important thing here is what conclusions each side draw from what's happening at the moment. Neither Russia nor the United States wants to see a complete implosion in Syria. until just a couple of days ago, Donald Trump's administration at least gave the impression that it recognized that Russia was perhaps the best hope for building some sort of post-conflict consensus and stability inside Syria, and that if necessary, Bashar al-Assad had to be part of that equation, because the most important thing at the moment was the fight against the Islamic State. I think those fundamental essentials remain in place, that the Americans recognize that if the Assad government simply implodes, collapses, nobody wins. That the vacuum will be replaced by jihadist groups like Islamic State and whatever follows Islamic State. So both sides, I think, have a vested interest in cooperating to a degree. I think it's now become clear that as far as the United States are concerned, Assad can no longer be part of the future equation. But what does that mean? Does it mean get rid of the regime altogether? Probably not. I think what the Americans will be saying to Putin and his people now is, let's get rid of Assad, but the bargain is this. We work together on maintaining the regime, because the regime is all that prevents Syria falling into chaos. But that, I think, is what they've got to work on. I don't think following this that the Americans, given Donald Trump's character, are going to say, OK, but let bygones be bygones. We've meted out the punishment now. If Assad behaves in the future, perhaps we can do a deal with him. I think we've gone past that stage now. Assad will have to go. The difficulty for Russians will be, how do they present that to their own public? How do they accept that without losing face?